Stay with me, because what Europe just put on the table is not a warning whispered behind closed doors. It's a condition stated out loud, and it's aimed straight at Washington. Late this week, European officials made it clear that if tensions around Greenland escalate further, there will be limits. One of those limits is stark and unprecedented in tone. No American operations from European bases if this crosses a line Europe cannot justify. That single sentence tells you how serious this moment is. For decades, U.S. access to European bases has been treated as automatic. It's been the backbone of transatlantic military cooperation, the quiet assumption underneath every joint operation, every contingency plan, every show of unity. Europe questioning that access is not normal. It signals that trust, not capability, is now the issue. Before we go any further, if you want clear, calm explanations of moments like this, subscribe to Capital Fallout. This channel exists to unpack power shifts that don't always come with flashing lights, but still change the world. Now let's slow this down, because this didn't start with a single headline. It started with rhetoric. Over recent weeks, language coming out of Washington about Greenland shifted. What once sounded hypothetical began to sound assertive, strategic, pressured. And in Europe, that shift landed hard. Greenland is not just ice and distance. It sits at the center of Arctic security, shipping routes, and alliance commitments. For European governments, it is tied to legal frameworks and shared defense structures that don't bend easily to unilateral pressure. So when talk of force or coercion enters the conversation, alarms go off. Europe's response was measured, but unmistakable. Officials didn't threaten retaliation. They didn't announce sanctions. They did something more subtle. They reminded Washington that American power in Europe depends on European consent. That's where the phrase, "No American at EU bases," becomes explosive. These bases are governed by agreements that assume shared legitimacy and common purpose. They are not blank checks. Host nations retain authority over how their territory is used, especially when political legitimacy is in question. And Europe is signaling that legitimacy is now part of the calculation. From Washington's point of view, this feels jarring. American leaders are used to disagreements with allies, but not conditions framed around basing rights. That's why this story is bigger than Greenland. It's about whether alliance assumptions still hold when rhetoric escalates. There's another layer here that matters. Europe does not speak this way casually. When statements like this go public, they reflect coordination, conversations among governments, legal reviews, scenario planning. This isn't panic, it's preparation. And it raises a question that goes beyond any one administration. What happens when allies start planning for the possibility that American actions might fall outside shared norms? That question alone marks a shift in how power is viewed. For years, transatlantic security rested on predictability. Disagreements existed, but the underlying rules were stable. What Europe is reacting to now is unpredictability, especially around the use of force. Greenland has become the flashpoint because it exposes that tension so clearly. European leaders see Greenland through treaties and sovereignty. Some voices in Washington have framed it through leverage and strategic necessity. Those two lenses don't align easily, and Europe is choosing to defend the one rooted in law. That's why officials have been careful but firm. Any move that looks like coercion would cross a red line, and if that line is crossed, Europe will reassess its role, not loudly, not emotionally, but practically. Practical limits are powerful. Restricting base access doesn't dominate headlines, but it changes reality. Operations become harder. Planning slows. Options narrow. And military planners understand this better than anyone. Inside Washington, reactions are mixed. Some dismiss Europe's words as posturing. Others take them seriously as a signal that alliance cohesion is being tested. The debate isn't really about Greenland. It's about how far rhetoric can go before it starts reshaping relationships. And here's where this becomes dangerous. Words spoken publicly don't stay theoretical. Once allies start adjusting assumptions, restoring them is difficult. Trust doesn't reset automatically. Europe isn't trying to break the alliance. It's trying to protect it by setting boundaries before a precedent is set. Because precedents travel. If one administration treats allied territory as negotiable through pressure, future administrations inherit that logic. Europe is trying to stop that inheritance before it becomes normal. That's why this moment matters. Not because anything has happened yet, but because something has changed. Conditions have been introduced. And once conditions exist, relationships are no longer automatic. Nothing has been shut down. No bases have been closed. No agreements have been torn up. But the warning has been issued, clearly enough that it can't be ignored. And this is where part one has to pause, because the real question isn't what Europe just said. It's what happens if Washington pushes anyway. How much authority Europe actually has to enforce these limits, and where NATO fits when allies fundamentally disagree on legitimacy. That's where the story turns from rhetoric into consequence. What happens next depends on whether Washington treats Europe's warning as noise or as a real constraint. Because once conditions are spoken out loud, they stop being hypothetical. They start shaping decisions behind the scenes, especially inside military and diplomatic planning rooms. Here's what most people don't realize. European base access is not controlled by NATO as a single entity. It's controlled by individual countries: Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands. Each hosts American forces under specific legal agreements. Those agreements can be interpreted narrowly or broadly, depending on political context. And that flexibility is exactly where Europe's leverage lies. If a European government believes an operation lacks legitimacy, it doesn't need to tear up treaties to create friction. It can slow approvals. It can delay clearances. It can restrict what kinds of missions can originate from its territory. None of that looks dramatic on television, but all of it changes operational reality. This is why Europe didn't threaten withdrawal. It threatened conditions. Conditions are harder to challenge because they're framed as legal responsibility, not political retaliation. European leaders can say they are simply complying with domestic law, parliamentary oversight, or international obligations. That makes pushback from Washington diplomatically costly, and Washington knows this. Inside the Pentagon, planners model scenarios based on access assumptions. When those assumptions become uncertain, contingency planning becomes more complex. Routes change. Timelines extend. Risk calculations shift. The map looks different. That's why this moment is being watched closely inside U.S. defense circles, even if public messaging stays calm. Now, layer NATO into this because NATO complicates everything. NATO's core principle is collective defense, not collective offense. Article 5 is triggered when a member is attacked, not when a member initiates action others consider illegitimate. That distinction matters. If a conflict over Greenland were framed as unilateral or coercive, NATO would not automatically align. European leaders are signaling that clearly. They are drawing a boundary between alliance defense and unilateral action. This isn't anti-American sentiment. It's institutional self-preservation. European governments remember history. They remember moments when alliances were strained because one member pushed beyond shared norms. And they know that once norms erode, rebuilding them is far harder than enforcing them early. That's why Greenland has become the pressure point. Greenland itself isn't the real issue. The issue is what Greenland represents, whether force can be treated as leverage inside an alliance that claims to be rules-based. Europe's answer to that question is no. From Washington's perspective, that answer feels constraining. American leaders are used to having flexibility, especially when national security arguments are invoked. But flexibility shrinks when allies decide legitimacy matters more than alignment. This is the recalibration happening now. And it's not just about military access. Intelligence sharing, logistical support, diplomatic cover. These things also depend on trust. When trust weakens, cooperation becomes selective. That selectivity doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly. Fewer joint statements, more caveats, more internal debates before routine approvals. This is how alliances cool without breaking. European officials are also managing their own internal politics. Public opinion across Europe is skeptical of military escalation, especially when it appears unnecessary or aggressive. Leaders who appear complicit risk domestic backlash. That pressure shapes their posture toward Washington. So when Europe sets conditions, it's not only speaking to the U.S., it's speaking to its own citizens, signaling restraint and responsibility. That dual audience matters. Washington, meanwhile, faces its own internal divide. Some voices argue Europe will ultimately fall in line, as it has before. Others warn that assuming compliance is exactly what creates rupture. That debate is happening quietly, but it's real. And it leads to a deeper question. What happens when America's allies start planning around the possibility that U.S. leadership may not align with alliance norms? That question alone marks a shift in how American power is perceived. For decades, U.S. leadership was seen as stabilizing. Even when controversial, it was predictable within a shared framework. What Europe is reacting to now is the fear that predictability is eroding. That fear doesn't require action to be justified. It only requires credible rhetoric. This is why European leaders responded early. They are trying to prevent escalation by setting expectations now, not reacting later when options are fewer. It's also why their language is careful. They avoid personal attacks. They avoid ultimatums. They focus on process, legality, and conditions. That framing preserves space for de-escalation, but it also preserves leverage. Because if Washington pushes forward anyway, Europe can say it warned clearly. That matters diplomatically. It shapes how blame is assigned if things deteriorate. And that brings us to the uncomfortable reality. Alliances don't collapse in dramatic moments. They erode through misalignment, assumption, and ignored warnings. Europe is trying to interrupt that process before it accelerates. Whether that effort succeeds depends on what Washington does next. Does it recalibrate rhetoric? Does it re-anchor discussions in negotiation rather than pressure? Or does it treat European concern as weakness? Those choices will define not just this moment, but the tone of transatlantic relations moving forward. Because once allies start conditioning cooperation, restoring unconditional trust is extremely difficult. And this is where the story is heading next. In part 3, we're going to examine the legal and institutional mechanisms Europe actually has to enforce these conditions, how host nation authority works in practice, and what happens when alliance politics collide with domestic law. That's where this stops being theory and becomes structure. When this stops being theory and starts becoming structure, everything changes because conditions don't enforce themselves. Laws do, agreements do, procedures do. And Europe has all three. Host nation authority is not a talking point. It's a legal reality. Every American base in Europe operates on land governed by a sovereign government. Those governments grant permissions that define what can and cannot happen on their territory. These permissions are detailed, technical, and enforceable. They include airspace use, mission types, transit rights, and logistical support. None of it is automatic once legitimacy is questioned. This is the mechanism Europe is quietly pointing to. If a European government decides an operation falls outside agreed purposes, it doesn't need a dramatic confrontation. It can invoke domestic law, parliamentary oversight, constitutional review, administrative process. Each step adds friction. Each step slows momentum, and each step is defensible as rule following, not obstruction. That distinction matters. Because when limits are framed as law, challenging them looks like challenging sovereignty. Washington understands this, which is why these signals are taken seriously even when officials publicly downplay them. There's also the issue of classification. Many operational approvals happen under classified frameworks that require host nation consent. If consent becomes conditional, approvals don't disappear overnight. They narrow. They become mission specific. They require additional justification. And justification invites scrutiny. Scrutiny is the opposite of speed. This is where domestic politics inside Europe intersects with alliance politics. European parliaments demand oversight. Courts demand compliance. Public opinion demands restraint. Leaders cannot simply wave these pressures away, even if they wanted to. And many don't want to. For European governments, asserting host nation authority is not anti-American. It's pro-institution. It reinforces the idea that alliances function within rules, not above them. That principle is deeply embedded in European political culture, especially after decades of integration built on law. Washington sometimes underestimates how deeply that runs. In the United States, executive power in foreign policy is expansive. In Europe, it is fragmented and constrained. Decisions require coalition support, legal clearance, and parliamentary tolerance. That makes rapid unilateral alignment difficult when legitimacy is contested. This difference in governance styles is colliding right now. NATO doesn't override these constraints. NATO operates through consensus. If consensus fractures, NATO pauses. It does not compel. That's by design. And that design is what Europe is leaning on. When European officials say conditions apply, they are not threatening NATO. They are invoking its structure. That's why this episode is unsettling for American strategists. It reveals how much U.S. power in Europe depends on political goodwill, not just capability. Aircraft and personnel matter, but access matters more. Without access, power is theoretical. This is also why language matters so much. Rhetoric that frames force as leverage doesn't just alarm publics. It activates legal review. It gives parliaments reason to ask questions. It creates records. And records are the basis for constraints. Once constraints are written down, removing them requires justification. That's a higher bar than avoiding them in the first place. Europe understands this dynamic well. Another layer complicates things further. The European Union itself has no standing army, but it has legal frameworks that influence member state decisions. Sanctions regimes, trade authority, political coordination. While basing rights remain national, EU alignment amplifies pressure. When multiple governments move in parallel, Washington can't isolate the issue to a single capital. It becomes a continental posture. That's what European officials are trying to build, alignment without escalation. They are also mindful of precedent beyond Greenland. If force is normalized here, what about elsewhere? What about future disputes involving resources, territory, or strategic choke points? Europe does not want to answer those questions later under worse conditions. So it is acting now. From Washington's side, this feels constraining at a moment when strategic competition is intensifying globally. American officials worry about signaling weakness, but Europe worries about signaling permissiveness. Those fears pull in opposite directions. This is where miscalculation becomes possible. If Washington interprets conditions as bluff, it may push harder. If Europe interprets pushback as disregard, it may formalize limits. Each step narrows the space for compromise, and compromise is what prevents rupture. What's striking is how quiet this all is. No shouting matches, no ultimatums, just carefully chosen words and procedural reminders. That's how serious alliances communicate stress, because serious allies don't posture, they prepare. Behind the scenes, legal teams are reviewing agreements. Defense ministries are updating guidance. Diplomats are drafting language that preserves unity while asserting boundaries. None of that makes headlines. All of it shapes outcomes. This is the phase where mistakes are hardest to reverse because they're embedded in process. And that's why Part 3 matters. It shows that Europe's condition is not symbolic. It is grounded in authority that doesn't require confrontation to be effective. Whether Washington adjusts depends on whether it sees this authority as legitimate or inconvenient. That choice will echo, because once allies demonstrate they are willing to enforce limits, even quietly, the balance of relationships changes. Power becomes negotiated again, not assumed. And that sets the stage for what comes next. In part 4, we're going to look at how Washington might respond, what options it actually has when access becomes conditional, and why escalation may look tempting but carries risks that extend far beyond Greenland. That's where calculation replaces rhetoric. When calculation replaces rhetoric, Washington's menu of options narrows quickly, because once access becomes conditional, power has to move through channels that are slower, louder, and more visible. And visibility invites resistance. The first option Washington has is recalibration. That means changing language before changing policy. It means lowering the temperature, reframing intentions, and recentering discussions around negotiation rather than pressure. Historically, this is how alliance stress is eased. Quiet calls, careful statements, a return to familiar diplomatic phrasing that reassures allies their concerns are heard. This option is the least risky, but it also feels like retreat to some voices inside Washington. Recalibration requires acknowledging that rhetoric overshot. For leaders who equate strength with insistence, that can be politically uncomfortable. The second option is compartmentalization. Washington could argue that Greenland discussions are separate from alliance operations, insisting that basing agreements should remain untouched. On paper, that sounds reasonable. In practice, it's difficult, because allies don't compartmentalize legitimacy. If trust is strained in one domain, it bleeds into others. European officials understand this well. That's why conditions reframe punishment principle and stay neatly contained. Third option, escalation alternative routes. Washington shifting logistics, seeking partners elsewhere, or reducing reliance on European infrastructure. This is sometimes described as diversification, but diversification takes time, resources, and political capital. It also sends a signal that Europe is no longer central. That signal cuts both ways, because while diversification may reduce short-term dependence, it accelerates long-term drift. Allies notice when they are being planned around rather than planned with. That changes how future cooperation is offered. There is also a fourth option, and it's the most dangerous one: dismissal. Treating Europe's conditions as bluster, assuming they will not be enforced, and proceeding as if nothing has changed. This option relies on history, on the belief that alliances always bend under pressure. But history cuts differently now. Europe is not signaling emotion. It is signaling readiness, legal readiness, political readiness, procedural readiness. That makes dismissal risky, because if Washington pushes and Europe follows through, even partially, the credibility loss is immediate. Credibility matters more than capability in alliances. And then there's NATO. Washington could attempt to use NATO forums to pressure European governments back into alignment. But NATO operates by consensus. Pressure inside NATO often hardens positions rather than softening them, especially when legitimacy is contested. Using NATO as leverage in this context could backfire, transforming a bilateral issue into a multilateral standoff. American officials know this, which is why much of the response so far has been muted. Silence in this case is not ignorance, it's assessment. There's also a domestic layer in the United States that complicates decision-making. Public opinion does not uniformly support overseas escalation, especially when the issue appears abstract. Greenland does not resonate emotionally with most Americans. Alliance fractures do. If European resistance becomes visible, it reframes the story domestically. It stops being about strategic ambition and becomes about isolation risk. That's not an easy sell. So Washington is balancing multiple audiences: allies abroad, voters at home, institutions that value stability, and voices that equate flexibility with weakness. This balancing act is why responses feel cautious. Another factor shaping Washington's calculations is precedent. If Europe successfully conditions access here, it sets a model, not just for Greenland-related scenarios, but for future disagreements. That model would empower allies to assert limits earlier and more confidently. Some American strategists see that as healthy. Others see it as constraining. The disagreement is not new, but it's becoming sharper. What complicates everything is timing. Global competition is intensifying. Crises elsewhere demand coordination. Fragmentation carries opportunity costs. Europe knows this. Washington knows it too. That mutual awareness creates pressure to resolve this quietly. But quiet resolution still requires movement. If Washington chooses recalibration, we'll see softer language, renewed emphasis on alliance consultation, and deliberate distance from any suggestion of coercion. That path restores predictability. It doesn't guarantee agreement, but it rebuilds trust. If Washington chooses insistence, Europe will likely formalize conditions, not immediately, not dramatically, but through guidance, reviews and approvals that become increasingly narrow. That path preserves principle, but increases friction. If Washington chooses dismissal, escalation becomes likely, not because Europe wants conflict, but because institutions respond to ignored warnings by hardening positions. None of these outcomes are inevitable. They are choices, and choices are shaped by how leaders interpret signals. Europe believes it has sent a clear one. The question now is whether Washington hears it as a threat or as an invitation to reset. That distinction matters, because threats provoke defiance. Invitations allow adjustment. So far, Europe's language leans toward invitation, firm but not inflammatory, conditional, not punitive. That leaves room, but room doesn't stay open forever. Behind the scenes, calendars matter. Reviews have timelines. Parliamentary sessions have schedules. Legal opinions have deadlines. Once those processes conclude, positions solidify. This is the window we're in right now. A window where rhetoric can still be dialed down, where alliances can still recalibrate without losing face, where Greenland can return to negotiation rather than confrontation. Whether that happens depends on how Washington responds in the coming weeks, not months. And that response will shape not just this episode, but how power and permission function across the Atlantic going forward. Because once access becomes conditional in practice, not just in theory, the alliance enters a new phase, one defined less by assumption and more by negotiation. That's the moment approaching. In part 5, we're going to bring this together. What this episode reveals about the future of alliances, why Greenland became the trigger, and what it tells us about how power is changing in a world where consent matters as much as capability. That's where this story finds its meaning. And when we talk about meaning, this is where everything finally comes into focus, because Greenland was never really the point. Greenland was the trigger, the spark that exposed something much larger, something that had been quietly building underneath the surface of the transatlantic alliance. What Europe did here was not about humiliating Washington or flexing independence for headlines. It was about redefining a boundary that many assumed no longer needed to be stated. A reminder that power, even American power, still moves through permission when alliances are involved. For decades, the transatlantic relationship ran on habit, shared history, shared enemies, shared assumptions. American leadership was treated as stabilizing, even when controversial, because it operated within a framework everyone understood. What changed was not geography or capability. What changed was predictability. Europe's condition that American operations from EU bases would not be automatic under certain circumstances is a signal that predictability now has to be earned. And that matters deeply, because alliances are not contracts frozen in time. They're living systems, respond to behavior. When behavior feels unpredictable, coerced systems adapt, sometimes poorly. Greenland became a moment when Europe decided adaptation could no longer stay private. This is also why the word invasion, even when used rhetorically, landed so hard. It crossed from strategy into legitimacy, from negotiation into pressure. And once legitimacy is questioned, everything downstream changes. Europe reacted not with anger, but with structure. Structure is how institutions defend themselves. By introducing conditions, Europe shifted the conversation away from emotion and toward rules. Rules about sovereignty, rules about consent, rules about how force fits into alliances that claim to be defensive, not coercive. That shift is subtle, but it's powerful, because now the burden has moved. Instead of Europe having to explain resistance, Washington has to explain insistence. Instead of allies automatically aligning, alignment has to be justified. That's a different world. It doesn't mean America is isolated. It doesn't mean alliances are breaking. But it does mean alliances are maturing in a way that reduces unilateral space. And for a system long built on American initiative, that adjustment can feel like loss. But it can also be read as stability. Because stable alliances don't rely on silence. They rely on boundaries that are respected before they're tested. What happens next will depend on whether this episode becomes a lesson or a warning ignored. If Washington recalibrates language and recenters negotiation, this moment will fade into the background as a near miss. A reminder that rhetoric matters, but relationships matter more. If it doesn't, the consequences won't arrive with a bang. They'll arrive with friction, slower approvals, narrower cooperation, conditional support, all defense, all quiet, all effective. That's how modern power shifts, not through collapse, but through constraint. And this isn't just about Europe. Other allies are watching closely, not because they want confrontation, but because they want to know whether alliance norms still protect them, whether sovereignty still counts, whether consent still matters when interests collide. Europe answered that question for itself publicly. The United States now has to decide how it answers back. What makes this moment so consequential is that it reveals something uncomfortable but true. In today's world, power is no longer just about who has the most capability. It's about who retains the most permission. Permission from allies, from institutions, from publics that no longer accept because we can as an explanation. That doesn't weaken leadership. It reshapes it. Leadership in this environment requires restraint as much as resolve, listening as much as leverage. And alliances that survive this shift will be stronger, not weaker. because they are based on choice, not habit. Greenland forced that conversation earlier than anyone expected, and Europe chose to have it now, while there was still room to steer away from escalation. It's the part of this story that often gets missed. This wasn't a rejection of the United States. It was an intervention on behalf of the alliance itself, a signal meant to prevent a future where lines are crossed and repaired too late. Whether that signal works depends on how it's received. And that brings us to the real takeaway. This moment tells us that the era of automatic alignment is over. The era of negotiated alignment is here. For some, that feels like loss of control. For others, it feels like accountability. History will decide which interpretation holds. But one thing is already clear. The transatlantic relationship has entered a phase where words matter more, assumptions matter less, and consent has become as critical as capability. If you've stayed with me through all 5 parts, I want to hear from you. Do you think allies should have the power to set limits on even the strongest members, or does that weaken unity in dangerous times? Drop your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter more than you think. And if this breakdown helped you see why a single sentence from Europe could carry so much weight, share this video. Someone you know may still think this was just noise. It was. This is Capital Fallout.